Our next guest was in the room where it happened when President Biden sat down with Vladimir Putin in Geneva this week. But what really happened in that room? And what about breaking developments in Iran and North Korea? Here now to discuss all that, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Jake, let's start with Iran, where, as we've noted, an Iranian hardliner, Ibrahim Raisi, has just been elected the new president of Iran. We should note that Raisi is under U.S. sanctions for his involvement in mass execution of political prisoners back about 3 decades ago. Question: what does Joe Biden think of Raisi?
Well, of course, we vigorously object to the worldview and the outlook that Raisi has put forward. We don't share his values. We don't share his interests. But, Chris, we also have to keep our eye on the ball. The person who will call the shots on Iran's nuclear program is not Raisi. It's the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, which you heard earlier from Lindsey Graham. He's the guy ultimately who will make the decision about whether Iran accepts the constraints on its nuclear program that will ensure that it does not get a nuclear weapon. That's what we are testing right now. That's what our diplomacy is all about. And we are determined to prevent Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon.
Now, there are reports that the administration wants to get a deal with Iran before Raisi takes office in about 6 weeks. I want to ask you about that. President Biden talks about a deal that is, quote, longer and stronger than the existing JCPOA, the existing nuclear deal that Donald Trump pulled out of. Will extending the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, which are supposed to sunset in 2030, which was 15 years when it was agreed on, but is now only 9 years away, will extending that sunset provision and also including Iran's nuclear missile program, will that be part of this deal, or are you going to have a second deal to handle those issues?
What we're intending to do is to reimpose the constraints that put Iran's nuclear program in a box. The limits on enrichment, the limits on stockpile, the intensive verification measures, all of which were included in the original Iran nuclear deal. Once we go back into that deal, Chris, the idea is to negotiate a follow-on agreement that will make for a longer and stronger agreement. That is the next step that U.S. Policy will take alongside our partners in the P5+1.
But isn't it going to be harder to get a deal? In other words, the sunset will then stay at 2030, which is only 9 years from now. Isn't it going to be harder to negotiate a longer, stronger deal when we have lifted our sanctions on Iran?
Well, I would say 2 things about that. The first is that we have proven now over the course of the past few years that we can reimpose sanctions in a devastating way, and the Iranians understand that, so we retain substantial leverage. Second, there are many more things that Iran wants in the way of sanctions relief that go above and beyond what's in the original Iran nuclear deal. So we will come to the table not just with sanctions leverage, but with a united front of the world powers that will pose to Iran a choice: either negotiate in good faith on a longer and stronger deal and make the commitments necessary to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, or they will face not just pressure from the United States, but isolation in the international community. The alternative strategy, Chris, which is the strategy that Senator Graham advocated for, the strategy that President Trump pursued, has put Iran closer to a nuclear weapon and even more destabilizing in the region. So continuing to go down that road is a recipe ultimately for failure.
Let's turn to the summit with Russian President Putin. Why did the Senate freeze a military aid package to Ukraine shortly before President Biden met with Russian President Putin? Now, I know that there was a $150 million aid package, military aid package, including lethal weapons to Ukraine, that went through. But why, in the weeks before the summit, did you freeze another $100 million package that a lot of people in the administration thought should also go through?
Chris, I'm glad you asked this question because there's been some real confusion in the reporting here. Congress appropriated $275 million for aid to Ukraine this year to be spent by September. It is June. We have spent every dime of every dollar of that $275 million for Ukraine. Joe Biden has kept his commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity by sending them the entire amount of the security assistance that had been authorized. The additional $100 million was a contingency package in the event that there was a further Russian incursion into Ukraine. That's money over and above the $275 million. And it was created when there was tens of thousands of Russian troops massed on Ukraine's border. When those troops pulled back and didn't go into Ukraine, we have held that package in reserve in the event that it may become necessary in the future. So it is there. And the Russians know it's there, and the Ukrainians know it's there. But the idea that we have withheld any security assistance from Ukraine is simply nonsense.
The pushback from Republicans is that Joe Biden displayed weakness in his summit with Vladimir Putin. They talk about waiving the sanctions on the Nord Stream pipeline, allowing it to be completed. They talk about freezing, whether it was a contingency or whatever, a $100 million aid package for Ukraine that had been ready to go and that the NSC froze. And then there's also the criticism that Joe Biden keeps talking about Vladimir Putin and his standing in the world when they say, the GOP does, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about his standing in the world. Here is former Trump Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Take a look.
They see American weakness, a president who blanches at even the ability to put pressure on Vladimir Putin in a private meeting. Right? Putin said himself he didn't feel any pressure.
In the summit, just to take one quick example, President Biden said, here are 16 areas of critical infrastructure I don't want you to attack, which seemed to imply, well, if you attack the 17th area of critical infrastructure, that's okay. Why didn't Biden say to Putin, look, no more cyber attacks, period, or you're going to face the consequences?
So first of all, it's pretty extraordinary to hear Donald Trump's Secretary of State talking about weakness in the face of Vladimir Putin when we all saw what happened in Helsinki. And the summit in Geneva was a study in contrast to what happened in Helsinki. Privately in the room, President Biden communicated to President Putin that there would be costs and consequences if harmful activities against the United States continued. Publicly in his press conference, he not only spoke out about that quite directly, mincing no words, but he also spoke about American values, something the last president never talked about. He spoke about Alexei Navalny. He spoke about Radio Free Europe. He spoke about standing up for our democratic allies and partners. And 1 week before the summit, 1 week, he sent $150 million security assistance to Ukraine. He pulled no punches. He did nothing but stand up for American interests and values in an emphatic and sound way. And I would also add, Chris, that he entered and exited this summit in Geneva as the leader of the free world, a mantle that Donald Trump had given away and that Joe Biden reclaimed on behalf of this country, flanked by allies, supported by Democratic partners, and then willing to push back hard on Vladimir Putin, which he did in the meeting, while also saying that there are areas where the United States and Russia must work together for the benefit of our two people. That is practical, that is clear-eyed, that is principled, that is Joe Biden's foreign policy.
Jake, I got 1 minute left, and I got one more question I want to ask you, which is about China. When asked how he's going to get China to come clean, to be more transparent about the origins of COVID, the President Biden, again talked about China's standing on the world. Here is a clip from President Biden this week.
The world's attitude toward China as it develops. China's trying very hard to project itself as a responsible and very, very forthcoming nation.
Does Joe Biden think that that is enough? China's effort to be seen in a certain way on the world stage, that's enough to get access to what happened in Wuhan? And is the president willing to let the WHO conduct a second investigation when there is compromise as they are, or is he going to insist that if there is an investigation, if China cooperates, it's an independent investigation?
What Joe Biden did in Europe this week was rally the democratic world to speak with a common voice on this issue for the first time since COVID broke out. President Trump wasn't able to do it. President Biden was. He got the G7 to endorse a statement saying in unison that China must allow an investigation to proceed within its territory. And it is that diplomatic spade work, rallying the nations of the world, imposing political and diplomatic pressure on China, that is a core part of the effort we are undertaking to ultimately face China with a stark choice. Either they will allow, in a responsible way, investigators in to do the real work of figuring out where this came from, or they will face isolation in the international community. And finally, the president reserves the right, through our own analysis, our own intelligence community's efforts that he has directed, and through other work that we will do with allies and partners, to continue pressing on every front until we get to the bottom of how this virus came into the world and who has accountability for that.
Jake, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Please come back.